Okay, thank you, Kevin. And I'd like to say thank you to Reasonable Faith Adelaide for this opportunity to present on the subject, the Gospels that didn't make it. So, first of all, I would like to just present an outline of what I'm going to talk about, so you'll know where we are through the talk. I'm going to talk first of all about the Da Vinci Code and other writings of Dan Brown, because it's through him that this whole subject has become quite popular in the recent years, and something about it has become known. I'll deal with what that is as we go through. Then I want to talk about, well, what actually is a gospel? If we talk about the gospels that didn't make it, that means they didn't make it into the canon, into the Bible that is commonly received and held these days. Well, what is a gospel? Then I'm going to look at the Nag Hammadi library, which is where most of these non-canonical gospels came from. And so we'll talk about that. Nag Hammadi is a place in Egypt, as we'll learn later. I'm going to tell you how I've gone about my research and reading of these Gnostic Gospels, and there'll be an analysis of their contents and a comparison with the Bible. Then I want to have a look at, well, what the Bible actually says about Gnosticism. It doesn't use the word Gnosticism, but there's quite a number of passages in the Bible which would be pointers in that direction and about people who were Gnostics or who had Gnostic tendencies. So we'll look at that. And finally, I'll conclude with lessons from the Gospels that didn't make it. So that's an outline of the address. Okay, the Da Vinci Code. In 2003, a book by that title was published by Dan Brown, who was an American, and then later a movie was released in 2006 that was based on the book. They were both very popular. The book sold tens of millions of copies, and the movie took made a huge income from the movie as well. When you're on a good thing, people tend to stick to it, so Dan Brown wrote some more, and he wrote a number of other books, and on similar vein, about a similar kind of subject, and they too have been very popular. He's written 8 altogether, 8 books, over 200 million copies sold worldwide. 3 movies have been made from some of these books, and the books themselves have been translated into 52 languages. So that's quite a dramatic impact, and you can imagine that Mr. Brown has made not only a reputation from this, but a great fortune as well. Something about this subject has caught the popular imagination of the world today, and I think there are reasons for this. So from the point of view of impact in the modern world, it's been very successful. The book is claimed to be thriller fiction, but although it is thriller fiction, Brown claimed that it was substantially true. Everything in it. He first of all said everything was true, then he said, well, it's substantially true. Now, I must admit, I've not read the Da Vinci Code, and I've not seen the movie either. Only recently I read an outline of the plot. So let me just tell you, in essence, what it's about. The idea behind the story is that secret knowledge about Jesus, long suppressed by the established church, but understood by Da Vinci and encoded into his painting of the Last Supper and other things, hence the title, the Da Vinci Code. But this secret knowledge that was so long suppressed over the centuries has recently come to light, and it's radically and dangerously significant. It's an alternative gospel. Okay, so we'll look into these claims. But before we do so, I want to answer the question, well, what actually is a gospel? We know the first 4 books of the New Testament, which are illustrated there, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, as the Gospels. They're the Gospels in our Bible. But let me just explain how this word comes into usage. Gospel is itself a very old English word, but it's a translation of the Greek word evangelion. And what I have up there in the Greek letters is that word in Greek letters, evangelion. It's actually EU here, but in a word like that, we end up, it comes through into, when it's transliterated into English, that becomes a V. So, and the double G here, this is the Greek letter gamma, twice. When it's together like that, it's actually translated NG rather than double G. So that says evangelion, that's how I might say it in English anyway. And it's composed of two words, EU, you, which means good, and the second part you can see there, it looks like angelos, and indeed it's related to the word for angel, literally meaning messenger. The word angel really means messenger. So the two words are good messenger. And in the New Testament days, and just prior to that, it was a word that was occasionally used in the empire context. It was the word that came from the emperor, or it was the word about the emperor. So it was supposedly some good news that the emperor was bringing, or that he was arriving on the scene. And so the gospel was, well, the emperor's here and he's going to announce something to us. But it very quickly acquired a specifically Christian meaning, and because of its usage in the New Testament. And so from that time onwards, the Christian usage displaced the older usage, and it's come to mean the good news, the especially good news. And in the Christian context, it's the good news about Jesus Christ, and in particular, salvation through Jesus Christ. So I just want to illustrate how it is used in the Bible. The beginning of the book we know as the Gospel of Mark, second in the New Testament, it reads, "The beginning of the Gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God." And then he launches into his 16 chapters. So that what is here, this whole book is itself the Gospel. Then in verse 14, we read that after John was put in prison, Jesus went into Galilee proclaiming the good news of God. That word there, the good news, is this very Greek word, evangelion, and so it's actually the gospel. So Jesus proclaimed the gospel. So the message that Jesus brought, summed up, is the good news, the gospel. In the end of Mark's gospel, in chapter 16 and verse 15, he instructs his followers, his disciples, his followers, who became the church, to take the gospel into all the world and to preach that gospel, that same good news. He says in verse 15 of the last chapter in Mark's gospel, he says, Jesus said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation." So that's how the word has the meaning it's acquired. And it's sometimes called the good news of the kingdom as well. So it can be given different full titles, but the gospel means the good news about salvation through Jesus. So we have in our Bible Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and they are called Gospels. Now, interestingly, the original never had those names on it. They were anonymous works. So the titles that we have in our Bible have been applied later. There's very good reason, which I won't go into now, to believe that they were actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Matthew and John being two of Jesus' 12, the 12 apostles, and Mark being the mouthpiece for the Apostle Peter, another one of the apostles, perhaps in many ways, the leading apostle, the spokesman for the group. And finally, Luke was not himself an apostle, but he was a very close associate of the Apostle Paul. And he also wrote the Acts. So these four were known from the early days were thought from the early days to be written by these four people, but they don't actually have the names on the original documents. So I'll come to that, the significance of that later. So that's what a gospel is. And in our Bible, each book is entitled The Gospel According to Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. So there really is only one gospel. It is the good news of Jesus Christ. But it's the writing by particular authors. Well, this is their presentation of the gospel according to their book. Now, the Gospels themselves are not biographies. They're not diaries. They don't record everything in Jesus' life. In fact, it says in one place that if everything was recorded that Jesus said and did, that the world wouldn't contain the books that would be written. But they are specifically selected actions of Jesus and a record of his conversations and his teaching, sufficient to give us a full picture of Jesus. The book is, each of these four Gospels tells us then these things, but it's written with a theological purpose. It's written with an intent. It's not just a biography, it's not just a diary. And we get some idea at the beginning of Luke's Gospel as to what was in Luke's mind, or the writer of this Gospel, when he did this. In Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, we read this, that in his introduction he says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." So this is Luke's explanation as to why he came to write this book and how he went about it. And in process, it's telling us, well, there were many others written as well. So the fact that there are other books that could be called Gospels that are not in our Bible is not surprising. These four are here for a particular reason. Now, Luke, as I mentioned, also wrote Acts. So at the beginning of Acts chapter 1, it's a kind of a second volume of Luke's presentation. He writes this, which is instructive as well. Let's just see what he says here. He says, "In the former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up to heaven." And then he goes on with what Jesus is continuing to do through the apostles and through the church. But see, that's in essence what the gospel was about. It's about what Jesus, what he did and what he taught, but with a specific purpose, okay? Now, the four Gospels we've had, they hang together very well, and they've been organised and used, recognised and used by the Church for nearly 2,000 years. And but last century, in December 1945, a very interesting discovery was made at a place in Egypt. Now you see on that map there where Egypt is, the Mediterranean Sea at the top here and the Red Sea down here. Here's the Nile going from north to south, Cairo's up here, and Nag Hammadi is a town right down the Nile, sort of midway in the country actually, between the mouth and where it flows into the country from Sudan. And a discovery was made there in December 1945. A local farmer, a peasant farmer and his brother, they were digging in the area, and this is the area here. It's actually near, it's not actually Nag Hammadi, but it's near Nag Hammadi. The Nag Hammadi is the biggest town nearby, but it's a fairly desert kind of location with this great big cliff. And they were digging, looking for suitable soil to fertilise their garden. And it was known that around the base of this cliff was some suitable ground, so they were digging around there when he found a pot. Now I would just like to read a little bit from a book I've got here about how this came to be. I'll refer to this book again later on, but let me just, if I can find, hang on. Maybe it's this other book, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I had my reference ready for that. I thought it was in here. Oh yes, it is here. It is this book after all. This book, the Everything Gnostic Gospels book, I'll mention again in a minute. But let me just quote from here because it sums up how this discovery was made. Sometime in December 45, Muhammad Ali, it's a good name for an Egyptian peasant, was with his younger brother, Abu al-Magd, and some other peasants on camelback near a cliff known as Jabal al-Tarif. It's a mountain honeycombed with caves. The group sought a natural fertiliser that had built up in the dry desert sands among the boulders near the base of the cliff. The peasants needed the fertiliser for their fields. With their camels hobbled, the peasants launched into digging. Abu hit upon an ancient earthenware storage jar. The red jar stood approximately 3 feet tall and was sealed with a large bowl. Initially, no one removed the bowl for fear that the jar held a bad spirit or a jinn inside. Anyway, Muhammad eventually broke open the jar and found a stash of old codices or leather-bound books, which you see pictured on the screen there. The 12 codices and 8 separate leaves that he discovered were not all later classified as Gnostic writings. We'll get to that in a minute. A total of 52 tractates were found. Anyway, he ripped apart some of the books to share with others, but his companions didn't want them. So he removed his turban and used the cloth to transport the books to his home. His mother started a fire with pages from some of the books. Muhammad Ali clearly remembered the date of the discovery. There was a blood feud, and so there's a bit about a murder here and vengeance and everything. It's really quite a colourful story. Initially when I read this, I thought, well, this all sounds very dubious, fancy a gospel coming from this, but this is the way discoveries occur in the Middle East. All sorts of strange things happen down at that level before it comes to the attention of someone who recognises the value of what has been found. Anyway, at some point after finding the codices, Muhammad gave a few of the texts to a local history teacher. The teacher sent one of the books to an associate in Cairo. He hoped to find out whether or not the codex had monetary value. It did. The latter purchase of the text by antiquities dealers piqued the interest of representatives of the Egyptian government. They acquired one copy and seized 10.5 of the 13 books. One of them got away somewhere, so the collection was kind of separated. So apart from some being destroyed initially, it got fragmented, but eventually it all came together in the Coptic Museum in Cairo, and then later on they worked on translating it. Now, near this place is a very ancient monastery. Modern times no longer there, but there's ruins of this monastery, a Christian monastery that goes way, way back to about the 3rd century. It's called the St. Pacamonius Monastery, and it's thought that the books might have come from there and been buried by them to escape being seized and destroyed, that the monks in this monastery wanted to retain this stuff, so they buried it with a view that they'd come back to it, but they never did. And so it's laid there in this very dry, hot, dry desert condition, sealed up in this jar, so it's preserved it till modern times. So that's how the thing was discovered. So, as I said, there were 11 complete books and fragments of 2 others, and there's well over 1,000 written pages. Now, it took a fair while before this information was really, first of all, photocopied and made available to scholars. It was all written in the Coptic language, and then translated into English. So there was a facsimile edition in 12 volumes published between 1972 and 1977, about 30 years later from its discovery, and then subsequent editions a few years after that. An English translation was first published in 1977 and then another in 1987. Most of this information I've presented here I've got from this book and from Wikipedia as well. So all this is well known, and this was the condition of the volumes. Now, what is actually in this library, as we might call it? There's 13 codices or books. That was the leather-bound papyrus pages. And what I've listed here on this and the following 2 slides is all the things that it contained. Now, there's a lot of very unusual names there. So first of all, you see the dot points. There's Codex 1, 2, 3, 4 on this page. And then the first one was known as the Jung Codex here, because the Carl Jung Institute got hold of this one. I mentioned how the volumes got separated, and they were separate for a long time. Anyway, it's come together. The first one contains these volumes here, these different books bound together in this one codex. The Prayer of the Apostle Paul, the Apocryphon of James, or the Secret Book of James. In fact, that's what Apocryphon means. It means secret book. The Gospel of Truth, the Treatise on the Resurrection, the Tripartite Tractate, and so on. And then Codex 2, 3, 4, and so on. Now, this is a typical page from the codex that was obtained. It's a little bit fuzzy there, but this writing is actually Coptic, and I didn't realise that I can read Coptic, but I can, because it's basically Greek. So if you look at that, you can see this is actually the title piece here, and looking at that, you can actually recognise this as K-A-T-A, Kata, and the letters there actually says John. And this part down here, I don't know what that bit there is for, but this is, I think that's an A. Say again? It does look like a lambda, doesn't it? But it's, anyway, this is a P, P-O-K-R-U-P-H-O-N. So that's the Apocryphon. So this is the book which is the Apocryphon of John, and that's like its title page. That's that Apocryphon, oh, that's of James, sorry, but there is, in Codex 2 here, there's the Apocryphon of John. So there's several of these Apocryphons. There's several books called Gospels here, which I'll mention further in a minute. But there's actually 3 pages listing all of these. This is also typical text. That's a bit harder to read, but I believe it's in the Coptic script as well. It's just a bit damaged. You can see that you haven't got the full thing there. And this last one, this is interesting too, because when we read this title piece down the bottom here, we've got that, you can see this word here. You can see that's E-U-A-G-G-E-L-I-O-N. Evangelion, Gospel. Kata, book. And this word here is the theta, T-H, that's O, omega, M, A, and C, or S, Thomas. So this is the beginning of the so-called Gospel of Thomas, which is perhaps the most significant book in all this find. Thank you very much, Anne. That's the most significant book in all this find. But anyway, they're all listed here in those slides. Now, there are repeats through it. You'll see, what can I show you? The Apocryphon of John occurs there in Codex 2. It occurs again in Codex 3. You'll find other ones. Here's the Apocryphon of John once more down here. Now, and some of the Gospels are repeated as well. Altogether, there's 52 different treatises in this collection. That's the list. You will notice amongst them several things to notice. One here is the Republic by Plato. And that's not a Christian work at all. That's pre-Christian. It's Greek philosophy. It's very significant Greek writing by Plato, one of their famous ancient philosophers. The original is not Gnostic either, but the Nag Hammadi library version is heavily modified with the then current Gnostic concepts. So all of this collection is sort of basically called Gnostic. Now some scholars have said not everything there is Gnostic, but the majority of it is. We'll get in a moment to what Gnostic signifies. But this book has been modified, but it's not Christian, not a Christian book. Now, several of these books are called Gospels. So you see, let's see if we can find them. There's the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Thomas, a sayings gospel. That's the one that we'll focus on shortly. There's the Gospel of Philip. What else is there? The Gospel of the Egyptians. There's several apocalypses. See, apocalypse, another apocalypse here, another apocalypse there. There's 4 apocalypses. Now, what else is there? There's no more there. The Gospel of Truth, I think that was a repeat of one they had before. Now, one significant one that's not there, that's been talked about a lot, is the Gospel of Mary. Could be Mary Magdalene. Some people, it's just called Gospel of Mary. But that was actually not in this collection. It would seem to relate very closely to them. It's got very similar thoughts and presentation, but it was actually discovered separately at another place called Akhmim in Egypt in 1896. And that too has been very much used by Dan Brown and others in their recent interest in this subject. So Dan Brown uses, the basis of what he presents is the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary in particular, but altogether this collection of volumes. Okay, so that's interesting that this has all been found and now interpreted into English and then analysed and compared with Gospels we've got and everything. Now, going on from here, I want to talk about the research that I've done, how I've gone about this, and then about my findings. So my research, first of all, began 2 or 3 years ago when I acquired this book, shown on the top left there, The Missing Gospels by Darrell Bock, Unearthing the Truth Behind Alternative Christianities. Now, Darrell Bock is a professor. He's a research professor of New Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary in the United States, and he's quite an author. I've seen him live on YouTube videos explaining lots of other things and in conversation with others, including with William Lane Craig, by the way. It's very interesting. You can find lots of stuff of his on YouTube if you look up Darrell Bock. Anyway, I first read this, and this is a very detailed and scholarly analysis of all these writings. He gives some of the background to the recent, in scholarly circles, the recent interest in this, and some people who are great publicisers of all this material. And then he's referred to Dan Brown, how it's caught the popular imagination. But he analyses very carefully, well, what's in common with all these books? Now, in fact, there's a great range of material here, but it does have some common threads. And then he compares it on a subject-by-subject basis with what's in the received Gospels in the New Testament and what we know from the early church fathers and things like that. So I found that book very helpful. Bock is a Christian, I would say, most likely an evangelical, conservative Christian. He's a very good writer, clear communicator, so I would commend that book. Following that, I then got hold of the second book through my local library and an interlibrary loan, the Gnostic Gospels, including the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Now, except for the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, all the stuff in there comes from the Nag Hammadi library. And so I've read all the stuff that's in there. Now, the people who are presenting this, there's an introduction in this book too to explain more about it, to try and put it in a very positive light. So the way it's presented here is from somebody who is really supporting all this material. So I certainly haven't read through someone's negative eyes. So it's just a straight translation to English of these texts. It's not every one of them, but it's a substantial number of the texts from this library. So I've read all those and some others besides in finding out then for myself, well, what do these Gnostic Gospels actually say? It's one thing reading how a scholar analyses it, and I could follow all that, but it's another thing to actually read it myself and make my own evaluation of it. And then I also borrowed this book from the library. This lady here, Elaine Pagels, she's a scholar, and she's been long behind long involved in studying these Gnostic Gospels. So her name is Elaine Pagels, and as it says here, long buried and suppressed, the Gnostic Gospels contain the secret writings attributed to the followers of Jesus. Now, interestingly, the Gnostic Gospels, the book in the centre there, I haven't got that to show. I couldn't get it from the library for this meeting. I'd had it and had to return it previously. But I've got this book, which I've substantially read, Elaine Pagels. It's quite well written. It's moderately scholarly, not as much as Bock's. And then here's a more popular work that I also got from the library, the Everything Gnostic Gospels book. So as you can tell from the title, it's a much more popular presentation of the material. But through that, I found out quite a lot about these, all these Gnostic writings and the Gnostic Gospels in particular. And I've absorbed what Darrell Bock has presented in his book, some of which I want to bring to you tonight. So I've come to this not just through having read most of the Gnostic Gospels and Gnostic material, but I've also come to it from a background of being very, very familiar with the Gospels that we have. So I know what I've read and reread countless times the Gospels here in my Bible in different English versions. I've studied things in it, and I've also done that in context with not only the New Testament but the whole of the Bible, so I know how it hangs together. So it's a very good basis to then come and look at something else. I must admit at the outset to you that I was disappointed in what I found in these Gospels, because despite all the very positive things said out there and that have come through it to us in the media, the difference between those Gospels and these ones in here is like chalk and cheese. They really are very different. I was expecting, given all that I'd heard, that they were going to be rather like the Gospels here, and I was wondering how am I going to be able to work out whether this is reliable as against that. You know, I was expecting to have a lot of alternative material, but in actual fact, it's so vastly different. It really is like chalk and cheese. But anyway, we'll get onto that in a minute. Now, the Gnostic Gospels themselves generally date to the 4th century, and 4 are called Gospels: Truth, Thomas, Philip and Egyptians. 2 are called Apocryphons, James and John. 5 are called Apocalypse, and there's also, I mentioned that, and I mentioned about Mary Magdalene. Yeah, so incidentally, the book by Bock there's another book by Bock in Kevin's table of books over here for the taking if you want, an earlier one than that, specifically on the Da Vinci Code and cracking the Da Vinci Code as he calls it. Now, the Gnostic Gospels. What I found in reading them, and this is a very big subject, so I can only present a little bit of material here, but it really fits into what is known about the Gnostics. The Gnostics, the subject of the people called Gnostics is nothing new. It's been known for a long time. References is been seen to them in many of the church fathers. Many of the church fathers in the first few centuries encountering heretical trends in the church and schisms and so on, encountered Gnostics, and they wrote in opposition to them. It's always in opposition to them. You never get from the church fathers any positive view of the Gnostics. They always saw their works and their ways as being as detrimental to the Christian faith. But anyway, so the whole subject of the Gnostics is worth considering, and these writings very much fit into the Gnostic scene and the Gnostic community. So who were the Gnostics? They were very ancient. They do go back almost to New Testament times, and you can see, as I'll show later, that there are indications in the New Testament that the apostles and others were encountering Gnostic tendencies here and there, and we'll see how they encountered them. Anyway, what's it about? The Gnostic's a funny-looking word. It comes from the Greek word Gnosis, gnosis. You don't pronounce the G, it's a silent G, gnosis. And that word just means knowledge. So it's a common word. The word is used quite often enough in the New Testament for knowledge and related words to that. But for this group of people, it was something very special. It didn't just mean any knowledge, it was secret knowledge. It was special knowledge that had been hidden from people and passed on to them, and they and those people to whom they initiated into their society were those who had this secret knowledge. There's actually a myriad of viewpoints amongst the Gnostics, but there's some broad tendencies. Basically, they were syncretistic. That means that they combined things from various sources. So it's often presented, some of these scholars and those who are trying to positively present these Gnostic Gospels and that want to say that, well, there were all these alternative views and these were just alternative views, and they just happened to be different from the mainstream. But they were syncretistic in that they absorbed Greek philosophy and other Eastern ideas generally into their thinking and their activities. They reacted against Judaism and they reacted against the Christianity of the day. So what I see here is that they devalued the Old Testament. And you see that in view, which I'll bring out in a minute, the way they regarded God, the way they regarded creation, what they thought of as wisdom and what wisdom meant, and the very process of redemption. All these basic concepts and things in religion, they differed not only from the Christians of the first century, the early church, but they differed from the Old Testament as well. So this is something I found surprising, and I'm going to bring out a little bit about the Gospel of Thomas because we haven't got time to look at all of these things, but the Gospel of Thomas is the one that's touted as being the most significant. It's the one that you can read and evaluate. And in that Gospel of Thomas, there are no references to the Old Testament, nor are there generally in their writings. There's no quotations from the Old Testament. There's no analogies from the Old Testament, very few. It's not in line with the Old Testament, whereas the Christian church of the first century was at pains to point out the continuity of what they were presenting with the Old Testament. That this was not something radically new and out of the blue. It was completely what you'd expect from the Old Testament. Now, I do believe that the Bible is a progressive revelation. There's definitely things that come out in the New Testament that were not clear in the Old Testament, but it's not a change from the Old Testament. It's a bringing out of what was there in germ form, or what was threads that the people pondered about how can these things be reconciled, and the New Testament gives the answer to all that. But that's not how the Gnostics were. They were against the Old Testament, and we see this in the way they thought of God. Now, I did have some quotations to refer to in these books, but it might be just easier if at this stage I just say this, and we can bring these out later in the discussion if you like. But most of their writings, there is more than one God. In fact, they believe that the God who created was not really good, and because their view of creation, the created order, material things, that was evil. Creation is deficient. It's the material world and nature is basically not good. So a good God couldn't have made it, and there's a lesser God who made things, and he's the lesser. That's the lesser God. Somehow they've got, in all the myriad of views they've got, he's connected somehow to a good God, but he's he's a secondary God or tertiary God or something like that. It's just like emanations or something. He's not the original God. So they have a view of God, and you can tell immediately how that is completely opposite to the Old Testament view. Because the Old Testament view, from beginning to end, it says there's one God, there's only one God, there's no other God. All the gods of the nations, they're nothing. They might call them gods, they might worship them and everything, but they're absolutely nothing than a piece of wood or a piece of rock or something. There's only one God. He did everything. He made everything. And sure, he made it. It tells us in different ways. He made everything by the agency of angels or his word or his spirit, and there are all ways that are presented. But it's the one God who is absolutely good and holy, who made everything. And the creation that he made was very good. Things have gone wrong, but he's made it very good. So the Gnostic views that pervade all their writings are about a different God and a different creation. Their wisdom too is, it's a different wisdom. It's to do with that you actually achieve holiness, you achieve salvation in the end, not by being saved. In fact, they don't need a saviour. You're saved by knowing something special. It gives you, and it actually brings you into your inner self. It's all in the inner self that you find the light inside. And this word that comes to you, the value of Jesus is that he gives you access. He tells you this inner word, or he points it to you so that you can then access this inner word, and that is how you are sufficient in yourself, and you only need Jesus to that extent. He's not our saviour, and he's not. The issue about authority is interesting too, because see, the New Testament, the church, the church that Jesus established, there definitely was authority in the church. Not everyone had the same function, and that too is in continuity with the Old Testament. God always had prophets, priests and kings. There was always a community, there was always leadership. It's not to say leadership was always good, or the prophets were always good either. There's failings, human failings throughout, but God nonetheless has provided this order. He's provided a community, he's provided order, he's provided lines of authority within a community, and he is the authority who has revealed his law and his precepts to human beings. And the church of the first century that we read about in our Bible is very much in continuity with all that. Now, the Gnostics were not like that. They didn't recognise the authority of the apostles because their view was that you actually had it within you. So there was nobody could really be over anybody else. It wasn't right. You all had it within you. So there was no real authority in their community. In fact, they didn't really create very cohesive communities either. They drew from Greek philosophy. They weren't really community-minded, and they weren't evangelistic. Now, the stories got out from things like Dan Brown's book, which is really just a popularisation of a view that's there, is that these alternative views were brutally suppressed by the church, and the people were put down and kept down and everything. Now, I don't really think that is true for several reasons. The church never had such power until after the time of Constantine in 300 and something or other AD. In fact, it was really later on towards the end of that century, the end of the 4th century, 370, that there was actually the church had any power to persecute people. Prior to Constantine's time, they were themselves subject to persecution. So the only way that church leaders could exercise authority, it was in a voluntary society, and it was by means of persuasion and discourse, by their words, that they could maintain some discipline within the church, and they could deal with members who were going off the rails in their view. They didn't have the power of the sword or any physical power to persecute people. They were themselves subject to persecution. Now, I don't think it was a good thing that the church ever got that power, but that's another matter. They certainly didn't have that power until after Constantine's time. So in these early centuries, when these Gnostics were there, the reason why the Gnostics lost out was not because the church of the day persecuted them. It was because, in my view, the bottom things there, they really weren't very community-minded. With having no authority within their communities either, everyone was sort of equal, it's all very nice and democratic and so on. There was no leadership within the communities, and nor were they evangelistic. Their whole tone of their writings is there's no encouragement there to preach the word, to go out, even in the midst of being persecuted and facing hostility from the world, as the Christians did. And we know from the record in the New Testament how they went out and how the word of God continually went out, and people were converted and brought into the church in the midst of persecution and hatred from others. But these people, the Gnostics, didn't have any. You don't get any evangelistic drive in any of their writings at all. It's a kind of a self-satisfaction with what they have individually within. Okay. Now, in fact, I've got a quote there that says it's from a Rosicrucian manuscript, which is interesting. So they must be very much in the Gnostic line. One of their sayings is, "The key to all mysteries and the source of all illumination lies deep within the self." And that could very well be what that could be a summary of the Gnostic ways. Okay? Very modern too, yeah. Okay, now, I wanted to just compare some things here, and I thought perhaps what I might do is just to quote a few things from this Gospel of Thomas. Now, this is also something I found a bit surprising, being called a gospel, and the other ones. When I came to read them, I was expecting something like the Gospels I'm familiar with. There's nothing like it. The Gospel of Thomas, which is regarded by those who look favourably on the Gnostics as the number one item, it's merely a collection of sayings of Jesus. They're not in context. There's no record of Jesus having discourses with people. There's no record of him doing anything, nothing about his birth, about his baptism, or about later on about his death or his resurrection. All those things which is the passion which is so important in the four Gospels we have here. There's none of that at all. There's just completely, there's sayings virtually by themselves with no context at all. So, and when you read through these sayings, you see, there's quite a lot of them are like the ones we're familiar with. Some of them identical, some of them a bit different. Let me give some examples. These are some that are similar or identical to the Bible. There's 114 sayings altogether in this gospel, so-called gospel. Jesus said, "The crop is huge, but the workers are few. So beg the harvest boss to dispatch workers to the fields." I think we can ignore the fact that it's using the word boss here. That's just a translation from some other language. But that's virtually identical with what we have in the Bible about the workers being few, and pray to the Lord of the harvest that he will send workers into the vineyard. Another one, this is number 90. Jesus said, "Come to me, for my yoke is comfortable and my lordship is gentle, and you will find rest for yourselves." Yet another, "Don't give what is holy to dogs, for they might throw them upon the manure pile. Don't throw pearls to pigs, or they might," and there's some bit missing here. Then 94, Jesus says, "One who seeks will find, and for the one who knocks, it will be opened." Now, all those sound very familiar to us, don't they? And there's a few others which may come out in discussion. There's some that are like the Bible, but they're a bit twisted or with weird extensions to them. Like this one, this is number 2. Jesus said, "Those who seek should not stop seeking until they find." Sounds pretty good. "When they find, they will be disturbed. When they are disturbed, they will marvel and will reign over all. And after they have reigned, they will rest." Now, that's pretty strange, isn't it? You know, it's got some element there that connects with what we know from what Jesus says, but it just sounds a bit, I just think, odd. And it's not just that it's new to me, it really is odd. Another one here, "They showed Jesus a gold coin and said to him, 'The Roman emperor's people demand taxes from us.' He said to them, 'Give the emperor what belongs to the emperor. give God what belongs to God, and give me what is mine. Now, that's you can see how that's related to saying we've got in the gospel too, but there's that additional bit on the end. It doesn't, when you know the context of the situation, that doesn't seem to make sense there. What Jesus, the first two parts make complete sense. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. But then he says, give to me what is mine. Okay, now there are others which seem to me very much nonsensical or clever sort of sayings. And a lot of these things have a kind of cleverness about them, and not surprising because they delighted in the intellect. That's where they were focused. They were focused on intellectual things and being above everybody else, really. They were the special ones to whom they'd got this secret knowledge. This is number 7. Jesus said, "Lucky is the lion that the human will eat, so that the lion becomes human. And foul is the human that the lion will eat, and the lion still will become human." Now that's really weird, I think. Here's another. Jesus said, where there are three deities, they are divine. Where there are two or one, I am with that one. Bit mixed up. Another 74, he said, "Lord, there are many around the drinking trough, but there is nothing in the well." Another, Jesus said, "Damn the flesh that depends on the soul, damn the soul that depends on the flesh." I think there's a difference between flesh and soul there. I don't understand that, but it's a very strange way that is put. And it doesn't seem to gel with all the rest that we've read. Now this final one takes the prize, I think. This is the last saying in the list. And given that the way it's been popularised, this whole thing's been popularised by Dan Brown and others, this bit is hidden. This bit's not brought out because it would go very against what they think is something that's going to appeal very much to the modern world. Simon Peter said to them, now this is where it does refer to someone else other than Jesus in these sayings, but there's no more context than this. This is saying 140. Simon Peter said to them, "Make Mary leave us, for females don't deserve life." Jesus said, "Look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." That's the final saying in the Gospel of Thomas. So, yeah. So it's rather, when you read things like this, you think, well, not only does it, I think you would agree with me that the whole so-called Gospel of Thomas sounds pretty dubious and pretty strange, and nothing like the Gospels we've got. But also, it's been presented in a way that's deceptive. It's been presented not by the Gnostics, but by modern people. It's been presented by modern people who they've got a certain message to get out there, and it's even what they're getting out is deceptive because they've hidden that bit, because that just really wouldn't go down at all well, would it? And so likewise, throughout all the rest of their materials, there's all this kind of stuff as well. So my general impression of it was that it's inward looking, it's looking for the light within, and it's delighting in having a secret special word that's come to me, that Jesus has given me, that other people don't have, and that it's this word that's giving me status and by which I'm going to be saved. Okay? So what I've said here in summary is that the Gnostic Gospels, etc., are not like the New Testament. They are very, very different. And I think, having seen some of this recently, I can see how clear it would have been to those deciding right back then, well, what should be included in the New Testament. The Gospels we have, I never tire of reading them because they are really, truly wonderful, and they present a very full picture of Jesus in all that he did and said, not literally everything he did and said, but sufficient so that I might know who he is, and I might know that he's altogether wonderful, he's altogether lovely, he's got authority, and he's to do what he said he would do. He's reliable, he's truly wonderful. And you just do not get that in these other writings at all. It is just chalk and cheese. So throughout all the writings, you don't get any comprehensive picture of Jesus. You don't get any sense of a need for God or a saviour. There's no real need for community or leadership in any of their writings. And what I found was that there's no enduring faith. There's no stimulus in it to persevere in face of persecution and to inspire you to hope for something. There's nothing there that would enable you to face persecution and to endure deprivation and suffering. There's no enduring faith in it. There's no inspiring hope. And what I think is quite damning, really, and you wouldn't know this unless you were really familiar with the Old Testament, but there's definitely no continuity in the Gnostic writings and the Old Testament. They want to say, well, they were alternatives to the Christians, but the Orthodox Christians of the first few centuries, they were in continuity with the Old Testament. They had a very high regard for the Old Testament. They were their scriptures that they quoted from and that mattered to them, and you just don't get that with the Gnostic community. So there's no continuity with or regard for the Old Testament. Now, I'd just like to say that the Bible itself, Gnostics definitely do go way, way back. And these Gnostic writings, I don't think they're as ancient as the writings we have here, that became our New Testament, but they are nonetheless very ancient. So what does the Bible say about Gnosticism or Gnostic tendencies? You actually find quite a number of passages, and when you search for it, you find more and more that are relevant to this whole issue of Gnosticism. Paul, writing to Colossians, the church at Colossae, in chapter 2, verse 8, he warns against hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and on the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ. And if he didn't actually have Gnosticism in mind there, he must have had the tendencies which became entrenched in the Gnostic communities later on. Again, Paul writes to Timothy in his first letter to him, chapter 6, verses 20 and 21. He's warning Timothy. Timothy's a young leader that Paul is encouraging and helping him to organise the churches in his area and to take his role in the church. And he says, he talks in his letter about godless chatter and the opposing ideas of what is falsely called knowledge. Now there's that word knowledge, that's the Greek word gnosis. Now, has he got in mind the Gnostic knowledge? Quite possibly, or some incipient, embryonic form of what became Gnosticism. And he describes this here, these opposing ideas of what is falsely called knowledge, as a departure from the faith. It isn't just something entertaining and something a bit of amusement. It will actually result in a falling away from the faith with judgment as the end result. Okay, so that's what Paul wrote. Here's Peter, in his second letter of Peter, chapter 2, his general letter. He says, beware of false teachers with their destructive heresies and fabricated stories. There's a lot of very fanciful stories in the Gnostic writings too that are really pretty way out. And they were certainly regarded as heresies by the Orthodox Christian church of the day. So I think Peter had these people in mind as well. Now John writes quite a lot. I haven't time now to quote more extensively from this, but he basically says beware of antichrists. And he tells of the way in which you can determine whether this person or group is an antichrist. Is if they say that if they don't say Jesus has come in the flesh, and the docetic tendency, that is the idea that Jesus was not really real, wasn't really human, he inhabited a body, or maybe he wasn't even human. there's a lot of threads of Gnosticism like that too. So what he writes about the Antichrist and Antichrist views are very relevant to Gnosticism. And there's the passages. John brought us the revelation of Jesus Christ too. And there's these 7 letters from Jesus to the different churches in Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. And again, in one of them he says to a church to keep away from Satan's deep secrets. Now, the very expression deep secrets is so Gnostic. That's just what they're all about, having deep secrets, and that made them special. Now, in a sense, all of these things, you'll find things in the Bible that you can get hold of and twist to make it like some of this. For example, secrets. The Bible does talk about mysteries and the mystery of God, but it's a mystery that's revealed, that's opened up to everyone. Jesus did teach in parables too, and that was so that it was hidden from some and revealed to others. But the explanations are all given to us. And the way it's hidden is because of people's hardness of hearts. People actually hide it from themselves because the ability to actually come into the meaning of what Jesus taught was there for everyone, and it's there for us as we read the Bible. So that doesn't equate. Superficially, you can latch onto things, but they don't equate. The Gnostics really were quite opposed to authority in the church. They didn't recognise any of the authorities. And I'm not saying that all authority in the church was properly exercised. Right, we know it wasn't. But nonetheless, it was established by God, and there were a great many good leaders in the church, and good bishops and pastors and so on. But the Gnostics were opposed to the idea of God's authority in that way. But this is nothing new. It's always been like this. If you look back in the Old Testament, back to Numbers chapter 12, that's the time of the Exodus from Egypt. Moses was opposed by his brother and sister, Miriam and Aaron, and God had to deal with that. So there was a challenge to his leadership, and the challenge was, God hasn't just spoken through you, he's spoken through us as well, and we're as good as you, and so on. So it goes way, way back. And in New Testament times too, in these passages I've quoted here, and in the 3rd of John, there are references to people who were opposing authority within the church, endeavouring to use it for crass purposes, for material gain, for self-elevation, for drawing away disciples after themselves. There are indications, generally contained in the New Testament period, but nonetheless there are indications in the New Testament times of people doing just those things that had to be opposed in God's name, not by physical persecution, but by instruction and by a word from God. Okay. So that's what the Bible says about Gnosticism. So finally, lessons from the Gospels that didn't make it that I'd like to bring. Well, the Gnostic Gospels are an alternative view. There's no doubt about that. They're an alternative gospel, if you want to use that term. But that's nothing new either. There's always been an alternative word, going right back to the Garden of Eden. God gave the word. The next thing you know, the evil one's there giving it an alternative word. So right from the beginning and all through the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's always been an alternative word. There's always been a rebel's defiant stand. There has always been a false gospel there as well, in kind of distinction to the real gospel. And what I've found in all such false gospels, including these Gnostic gospels that I've had a reasonably close look at, there's no true life in them. The outcome is always loss and death. And now these particular ancient false gospels, these Gnostic ones, they seem to resonate with many people today. Now, I think this is very superficial that it does. People don't really look into it. They pick up these superficial things in books and movies like the Dan Brown material. That they never actually go in to find out, well, what is it really about? And so people, it's convenient. It provides people superficially with a convenient answer to to oppose the authority of God, basically, and to oppose the church, to oppose Christ. And that's basically what the effect of this has. These 200 million books that have gone out there that people have read so keenly and everything, the end result is not that people end up searching, well, how does Matthew, Mark, Luke and John compare with the Gospel of Barnabas, the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Mary, and how do they really compare? And nobody does that. Hardly anybody would think of doing that. They just pick up something superficially from these books that, oh yeah, there was a struggle in the early church, and this was just as valid as that, but it got suppressed, and this has got so many features about it which is modern, and because it's all so anti-authority and the light's within, and this is the word of this age. And I think they're the reasons why stuff like the Dan Brown material has caught on with people, why it resonates. But they're actually woefully inferior to the gospel. The gospels that we have in here, or the one gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, the message it contains, is uniquely wonderful and reliable. And the others just do not measure up. So we have every reason to stay focused on the gospel that we have here and in its context, in the whole of the New Testament, the whole of the Bible, because it really is uniquely wonderful and reliable. So finally, I'd just like to say, because of that, I'd commend us all, myself included, to read the Bible regularly, carefully and reverentially. Thank you.
A couple of Gospels that are often mentioned are the Gospel of Peter.
Yes, that wasn't on that list, was it?
No, because that wasn't in the Nag Hammadi collection.
No. There are other sources, other ancient documents. So no, I couldn't say at the moment where that one came from, where that was found. The Nag Hammadi has been the big discovery. Mm-hmm. They put it alongside of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Dead Sea Scrolls are rather different. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 near the Dead Sea. This was in 1945, so a very similar era, very similar kind of climate environment. So desert area, no people living just there, very, very dry, hot environment, so that anything that would have been buried and put away in a cave or something like the Dead Sea Scrolls would last a long time. It's not going to rot due to moisture or insects or whatever.
So Nag Hammadi's in Egypt, whereas the Dead Sea Scrolls are in Israel.
Yes, they are, yeah. I've been near that. I haven't actually been to the Qumran community. But I know just where that came from. They were caves near the ancient Qumran community, which existed in Jesus' time and before Jesus' time. But it happened in both cases that there were communities that these documents would have belonged to, that for some reason that might not be completely clear to us, they were buried or secreted away somewhere, and then because of other events, so that community got decimated or dispersed or somehow or other, and they never came back to collect these documents, and so they've been there until modern days. So who knows what else is out there. Naturally, in both those locations, they've done a lot more searching to find what they can, and nothing more has come to light. But I did read about this site in Egypt, that that area too is riddled with caves, so no doubt they've been looking extensively for anything else.
I'm fair to say, about that time, there were heresies, other heresies within that time frame. Was it the Arius or whatever?
Arian, he was a bit later. Yeah.
No, that's later.
That's a bit later.
But within 100 years, so that, or so, was it? When were these buried, approximately?
Well, they're not quite sure. If it did relate to this monastery, that could have been in about the year 300, something like that. Yes. So they think, or even later in the 4th century, beyond that. So they think they were buried when this particular community may have thought they were going to be persecuted by the church power then. And by that stage, late in the 4th century, the church did have such power, and so they thought that these documents would at least be seized and destroyed, and because that was happening about that time.
Well, just to remind us, Geoff, when was the canon of the Gospels that we know? What was the
this was the subject of another talk, I think.
Sorry, what was the question?
When was the canon of the New Testament actually decided?
Well, the whole 27 books as we have now was first listed sometime in the 300s. But that's when they were. Yeah, that's when they first appeared on a document, But I believe that particularly the 4 Gospels, they go way, way, way back. And,
but the church obviously had its meetings and
there are lists that aren't that don't include all 27 that predate that date in 387. But references to the various books of the New Testament can be found in the Church Fathers' writings, which go way, way back too. And that's the thing. Prior to this discovery of the Nag Hammadi library, the people did know about these Gnostics and other related heretics and so on, that the church was that were doing, as the Church Fathers saw, doing damage to the church. And so the Church Fathers wrote against them and against their writings.
And so these books are mentioned.
And so they're mentioned, these books are mentioned, and sometimes little quotes from it. But it was only been in recent times that they dug up the whole book, so now we can see the book. Because you can't, or even though the Church Fathers, are writing against something, you can't be 100% sure that what they say about the opposition is true, is right. At the very least, it could be coloured, and that's the same in any debate situation. You need to hear it from the horse's mouth, as it were.
Were the non-endorsed doctrine or books, were they burnt? Were they, or that was freely anybody could have what I'm saying is the books which weren't accepted, were they freely, you can have what you want?
As I see it,
were they persecuted for that? Were they had like a book burning?
Well, I haven't read that. They definitely did burn. There was definitely some getting rid of the books that the church didn't want. Much later. This was in the time of 387. There was a particular emperor, was it Theodosius? I think that was the name. Yeah. At his time, this is late in the 300s, way after Constantine's time, that there was an attempt made to get rid of other documents. And to suppress these other groups. But that was right. That was then. In the first 3 centuries, all the years up to 100, up to 200, up to 300, the church had no such power. The church was itself being persecuted. They were varied in terms of the intensity of persecution, but right from the beginning of the Christian church in the time of Jesus, the non-believing Jews were hostile to the Christians. They expelled people from their synagogues. They put anybody who needed relief, welfare and that, they put them off their list. They weren't going to attend to these because they'd become Christians. So in various ways and direct persecutions, well, they persecuted the church. They incited the Romans to persecute the church as well. And the Romans would have had their own reasons for persecuting the church because the Christians would not say that Caesar is Lord. So although in many ways the Romans were very tolerant, they didn't really care, you believe this God, you believe that God, and you believe in, the God of the Jews, so what, But if you won't say that Caesar is Lord or Caesar's divine, he's God in some way, that's why they were against Christians. So there was
the church would
opposition.
rise up against
Yeah, well, the church was the people who wrote for the church, the church fathers they very much wanted to present to the emperors and to leaders that Christians are good citizens, which they would have been, I'm sure. But the Romans had a suspicion that they weren't part of the community because they wouldn't also have the religion of Caesar worship. So that was for that reason that the Romans themselves were generally against the Christians. And like I say, that level of persecution went up and down. Sometimes it was pretty tolerant, sometimes it was intense persecution. But for the first 300 years, the church had no power itself to bring physical means, basically the sword or the threat of violence, to bring violence or the threat of violence against anyone. So if we were a church and somebody's deviating, the only way in which a leader of the church could do something about it would be by instruction, by saying, hey, what you're saying here doesn't fit in with what we've received from Christ and the apostles, and hey, it doesn't match the Old Testament. You see, what we believe is all in the fulfilment of the Old Testament. That was the only way they could...
they could also say you're no longer welcome.
Yeah, if that's what they would have done. Yeah.
Well, it means church splits all through the ages. That's why we've got so many different, because different people will pick up on different things, and that's not accepted. So it's a bit like all
church,
through the centuries. Now we've got, I'm not sure, whatever it is, 30,000 different sects of, some, believing different doctrine, different philosophies, different...
Some of those passages I listed there, which we didn't refer to, mention some people, this is in the writings of the New Testament, like in the third letter of John, he says that there's a fellow in that church who won't, Diotrephes I think his name was, who loves to be preeminent and he won't receive us, and he throws out those who were actually apostles, because he likes to have his own. Well, obviously that's an indication that even back then there were things happening in the church, and it's not surprising. That's human nature, isn't it? It's what's going on. But the work of God in the church, through its spiritual leaders, is to stop those kind of schisms, to keep united, keep the body united. And so there's lots and lots of instruction in the New Testament about that, and in the church fathers too.
Are you implying, Geoff, that if the Christians had the power, the military power, they would have slaughtered their enemies like anyone else?
No, I'm not saying that at all.
Well,
no, I'm saying a matter of history, that when you get to the latter 300s, the latter end of the 4th century, that's well after the time of Constantine, the church did acquire. It allied with the state. The state, it became the official religion. First of all, it was under Constantine's time, Christianity was for the first time tolerated. So you could be a Christian and you wouldn't be persecuted. Later on, they got to the stage where they said, Christianity's it, or their version of Christianity is it, and you can't have anything else. So by that stage, and I don't think that was a good thing, but that's a matter of history, that's what happened.
Yeah, because I would have thought I thought you were implying that the church didn't have the power, they were being persecuted. Yeah. But implying that if they did have the power, they would be just as brutal as anybody else.
No, not at all, because I think that's against the way of Christ.
That's what I'm thinking.
For any Christian, it's not the way that Christians should behave. Yeah. But people who, some people who call themselves Christians might behave like that, and that's what happened. And this is how the church... how it became Christendom, it's right down through the centuries.
So Geoff's real point there was that for the first 300 plus years, it wasn't even an option.
No.
So therefore, it cannot be put against them. They couldn't have done anything prior to that.
But what I was saying, if it was an option, if they did have it, then surely they wouldn't have picked up the sword anyway.
Well, if there was persecution of these Gnostics in, say, the 200s, then that could not have been from the other Christians, because the Christians simply weren't in a position to do that.
Yeah.
But my reading of all these works, though, is that there just was not sufficient. There was not the inner power. There was not the inner motivation in the Gnostic writings to create that community and to make that community cohesive and to appoint good leaders that would do that. Whereas there is in the Christian church at large. And things went wrong, I know, here and there. But by and large, that's exactly what happened. There's a strong message in the New Testament for Christians to preach. Jesus said to everyone, go into all the world, preach the gospel and take this message to people. And, you will face persecution. Know that they persecuted me. They will persecute you too. And so he's preparing the disciples for opposition. He's giving them encouragement to have that hope before them of the future, to sustain them in the midst of suffering. There's so much motivation there of the Christian community, the Orthodox Christian community, to be like that. And there just isn't that kind of thing in the Gnostic community. So it's no wonder the Gnostic community died out. And, you know, they didn't need persecution to cause them to die out. They just had, there was no real motivating force there in the first place.
I think I'm right in saying, Geoff, but correct me, that the whole idea of having secret knowledge was in fact pre-Christian anyway. It was a Greek philosophy. Is that not correct?
Yep, it
and
is.
Therefore, as the Christian message spread into Greek culture, some who were already persuaded that way from their Greek background. And synchronisation of Christianity, all religions, is a common problem, isn't it?
The people have discovered links between these Gnostic views and Eastern religions too, even though... Pardon?
Zoroastrianism?
Yeah, Zoroastrianism, but you can even see links with Indian religions, not that... And they some I have read think there were influences even as from as far away as India into the Roman Empire at that time. So you had a whole mishmash of all these ideas floating out there.
You said inner contemplation, it sounds like Buddhism, you know, it's what Buddha did, you know, discovered his inner...
But the Christian view is a teaching about humility, that there's a need for humility, a recognition of our own need, and you can't get anywhere with God unless you do that. Now, Gnosticism is not like that. Gnosticism is like these other non-Christian religions, that I've got the inner light in me, and I'm actually okay. And the things that are wrong in the world and around me, that's there's reasons for that, but I'm not a part of that. I've got the inner light.
You made a comment there that the Gospels are not biographies. I agree that they're not biographies in the modern sense, in terms of here's a sequence, this happened in such and such a year, he was here, here's the order of events. But like one of the kind of realisations of biblical criticism from last century is that the Gospels are Greek-Roman biographies. And from the point of view that they're interested not in the order of events, but in portraying the person's character.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so they're very much like the writings of Plutarch when he writes the lives of various people. And so they will mangle the chronology.
Right, yeah. Chronology is something important to us, but it wasn't to them.
Yeah. So they will muck around and resort the chronology and tell the story in different sequence from each other, because they want to get a particular point across about this person's character.
Yeah, that could well be true.
Saint Luke, it looks fairly like a biography, doesn't it? It starts with him, his grandparents and his leads the way through his birth, and leads a year, when he's a 12-year-old going to the temple, and then and there's a few gaps, but then it leads on to his commissioning. And so
but Luke will alter the sequence that's in Mark.
He does
a few times.
But they really aren't biographies because they've got a theological intent. And even just looking at where it's focused, all four of them, it's a third to a half is 1 week, Jesus' last week. So that, it's not, sort of going all through the life sort of thing. It's a little bit here and here. Some of them, Mark doesn't even have anything up to before Jesus' baptism, does he? He's, you're in chapter 1, he's already into Jesus preaching. And the others don't. Luke has more to do with Jesus' birth, but John doesn't either. John's got this prologue, and then it's John the Baptist and the baptism of Jesus, and you're straight into it. So Jesus is already 30 years of age, and there's, not much about... So it's not a biography like we would think of it.
No, John clearly gives 8 examples. Here are 8 things that Jesus did, miracles that Jesus did. These are my testimonies to why I believe he's the Son of God.
Yeah.
So
it's written for a purpose, a theological purpose. But you don't get, you know, I mean, I've read the Gospels a lot, and I love them. They're very inspirational. I really think that. I don't just mean that in some vague sense. You read it and you get a really full picture of who Jesus is and how he interacts with his friends, with people who have fallen, with his enemies, with those who are attacking him, with the Romans, you know. You have all these interactions, and you have all the things that he did. And you have everything that he said in its context as well, you know? And I just didn't find that with any of the materials I read outside the New Testament.
Some of them try to fill in the gaps in terms.
Some of them make up fanciful things.
Yeah, like there's the infancy Gospel of Thomas,
yes,
which is different from the Gospel of Thomas.
Yeah,
and so that tries to expand on what happened to Jesus during his childhood.
That's right.
Because like there's a gap, isn't there? He's born, then he's 12 years old, then he's 30 years old.
From 12 to 30 is a big gap in Jesus. You know, we've got all these books, but yet we've got a massive big gap of what's happened to Jesus here, you know.
Yeah.
Even 0 to 12 is a big gap, you know. People are curious to know. Did anyone notice anything different about this child at first? You know?
The authors of the Gospels considered those were not relevant points to include.
That's right. That's right.
We'd like to know, but they didn't think we needed to.
Yeah.
Obviously his commissioning was at the age of thereabouts of 30, so that was his ministry. That's obviously what we do focus, and then as Geoff has said, it's that final week, which is the culmination of all that, isn't it?
But even the whole thing is really in a historical context, and this is how the Bible itself is different from other holy books, because it is so rooted in history all the way through. You know, I know that's not to say there aren't issues about, you know, when did this happen, when did that, and so on. I appreciate that, but it's very rooted in history. You know.
I've noticed when I'm reading about famous people in history, and I can't quote any, but it doesn't matter. It's so-and-so died such and such a year. They hardly ever say born such and such a year, or exactly how old they were when they died, because little babies didn't matter in those days. When someone was born didn't matter, because a lot of babies died, you know. But by the time they died, you know, as old, by the time they were famous, then someone cared the year they died. You know, that people hung on their last words, and you know, so the same emphasis. You know how you said it's really unusual, or not? You didn't quite say it that way, but I agree with you. A lot of each gospel is about that last week.
That's right.
But towards the end of someone's life is when you realise how important they are.
Yeah.
And you know, it's the same in a sense. You know, Julius Caesar might be, you know, died such and such. They won't say when he was born, or where, which hovel, which village, which...
They do actually about Julius Caesar.
Do they? I knew I should have known names. There's a few others anyway. They'll put the death year, you know. I knew I shouldn't have named them.
Well, take Churchill. He obviously probably take 1 or 2 points up to about 1938 or 39, but almost all of his life was really from when the war started and after that. So most people would say a few interesting things about what happened before then, but not much else.
Exactly right, yeah.
Oh, yeah, well, that's true. Yes, he did make a blue there, didn't he? Yeah.
I've got a question too. With the Dead Sea Scrolls, I mean, I'm not an expert in it, but I understand that it was thrilling for Bible scholars to find some bits and pieces of what we count as the Bible there in the manuscripts, much older than all the previously found ones.
That's exactly right.
Pretty much identical, you know,
That's
etc.
exactly right.
So with the Nag Hammadi find, did they find anything that's equivalent to the real Bible, or was it all the spurious?
No, it's all the Gnostic writings. It's all the...
Okay.
Well, there are
was that
other
list.
writings other than these Gnostic writings?
They're actually not all classified as Gnostic. There were a few other names, Hermetic or something or other.
Yes,
and there was that work of Plato mixed in amongst it, but there weren't any other. There was no Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John there. It was all this other stuff. And there's been other finds made, but it's just tiny by comparison with all the manuscripts that have been dug up. That are the background to what we have in our Bible.
Yes.
You know, there's literally thousands of manuscripts. So they're varying in age and everything.
How many books have been not included, Geoff? What type of number?
Well, I don't know. There's a list there. There's
there.
others that weren't there, like the Gospel of Barnabas, and you said the Gospel of Peter.
We're talking 50 books, 75 books.
We also don't know how many books we don't know about.
Yeah.
There's the
Books we don't know about.
If you want to have a look, if you go on the site called Early Christian Writings, and it's got lists of them. There'd be probably around about 60
60
there,
books.
and and you can read them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I thoroughly agree with Geoff. Like when you read them, the church had an easy choice.
Yeah, it's just obvious. It really is obvious. So,
because
I mean, having read it,
rubbish.
I mean, with the Gospels we've got, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, I anticipate I'll go on reading them for the rest of my life. And I'll delight in reading it because there'll always be something new there and it's just wonderful. But the ones I've read in that book, the selection, a large selection from those Gnostic writings, I wouldn't be bothered reading that a second time. If I read it a second time, it'd be because I'm trying to analyse something in it. But I certainly wouldn't want to read it 10 times.
Yeah, well, I've read the Gospel of Thomas, and it's only 134 verses or something, isn't it?
Yeah, it's all just saying.
Even at 134 verses, I got bored reading that.
It really is.
It was all over the place. It was nothing.
Yeah, it's just, some of it's really strange.
Yeah.
Well, it's like the Book of Enoch. We're talking about the grandfather of Noah. That to me seems to be very much up there, but it's not included. But yet the Bible actually talks about Enoch in a lot of different places.
Well, it doesn't matter about the name.
One verse.
What, only one verse?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, the book of Enoch was not written by Enoch.
It's just got a name on it.
Yeah, it's probably written around about 100 BC or something like that.
But then again, critics of the Bible would say Mark wasn't written by Mark, Luke wasn't written by Luke, and so on. So.
No, but there's like Enoch. There's thousands of years before, but it was no way it was written by Enoch.
That's right. The Bible doesn't feature the book of Enoch. I think it's only one verse where one of the letter writers of Jude says, "Don't slander people, because even so and so in the book of Enoch didn't slander an angel when he had an argument with him." And that's it. That is it. It's his
pretty obscure reference.
About don't. If you're having a fight with someone, don't slander them.
That's a different one again. That's a different one again.
Oh, sorry.
When the book of Enoch's talking about
Will come with Wallace Holy Angel.
Yeah.
It's the same book in Jude, the letter of Jude.
Sorry, I've conflated two things there. I apologise.
I don't understand what you're saying.
That thing she was talking about was something separate to the quote from Enoch that's in Jude.
Oh.
Well,
But anyway, it is an fairly obscure reference.
Yeah.
There was an interesting thing too that I didn't mention in my talk, but I did say that the 4 Gospels we have in the Bible were actually anonymous. There's good reason. The church very early on believed that they were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then those names were then attributed to it, but they're not in the original documents. But these ones, the Gnostic stuff, it is. So it says the Gospel of Thomas. Now, and likewise with the others, the other writings, and there's something in that. Whoever wrote those works wanted it to be thought of that this actually came from Thomas. So give it some authenticity, give it some authority. So right from the start, the Gospel of Thomas. So there's something there. There's a humility with the biblical volume that the person who wrote that didn't need to have their name on it. It was either understood by those who received it where it came from, or it didn't matter who wrote it. Its value was in itself.
Their aim was to present the Lord. It wasn't about who wrote it. It wasn't.
Yeah.
You're saying that Thomas didn't write that, but someone else wrote it with Thomas's name on it.
Yeah.
That's what you mean, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, so somebody is just writing this thing and they want it to be accepted. So how do we do that? Well, this actually came from Thomas, So we'll put the Gospel of Thomas, we'll write the Gospel of Thomas on here and pass it off as being the work of Thomas. Whereas Matthew, Mark, Luke and John didn't do that. They just simply wrote. They were the eyewitnesses and they just wrote. And
you said just read the Bible, but I'd say it's still worthwhile going and on a site like Early Christian Writings and reading these, so you can actually see the fish that John West rejected. So,
I would be cautious about that though. That people, you really need to read the genuine stuff.
Yes.
Thoroughly, as well. Yeah. If people just say, there's a Gospel of Mark, and then there's a Gospel of Thomas, and Thomas was one of the disciples, and Mark wasn't. Well, why do we have, that's people are so superficial. No, I'm not talking about people. Not talking about all you lovely people. I talk about them.
The people watching this YouTube clip.
All right, it's getting near the time. So after you're taught, so what? What should our reaction to all this be? Like in terms of our relationships with people on the outside, not just for our kind of own personal edification, but how we actually relate to the other people.
Well, just that we are aware of these Gnostic writings, that they are actually ancient, but that they're very, very poor quality, and there's no life in them. And what we actually have in the Bible itself, in those Gospels, is really something unique and wonderful and life-giving. And so encourage people to actually look there. Be aware of these other things, but so we're not just following something because we've never heard of anything else, but we're following something that is really good.
In fact, also, if I may say, Geoff, we find these only discovered about 300 years after the event, the earliest discovery, where we're getting fragments of the ones that we have, certainly from about 100, well, when was the Ryland scrap from John is coming in much earlier than that.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so thank you very much.
Thank you.